Hi, I'm Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline Lawyer. Today's question comes out of our Legal Hotline Mailbag. The question is, if buyer completes their own home inspection, meaning they didn't hire a professional inspector, but they did the inspection themselves, are they able to trigger item 5 on Form 35, which is the additional inspection provision, as there would be no recommendation from a licensed inspector? The answer is, this is a great question, because this is one of those questions that you could ask of 2 different industry lawyers and get at least 2 different answers. And while that format is really fun in a battle of barristers scenario, it's not really a very useful educational tool. So, great question, but I'm not going to answer it. I'm not going to answer it because to answer it, I would say, here's what I think, here's what somebody else thinks, and then you don't know what to do. Instead, I am going to make a suggestion that hopefully you can incorporate when you draft Form 35 to avoid this question altogether. This is a suggestion that buyer brokers are going to implement when their buyer has told them that the buyer intends to personally conduct the buyer's inspection of the seller's property. Set aside, because I want you to, hopefully all of you already know and remember that only a licensed home inspector can conduct a general home inspection or a whole home inspection of the seller's home if a third party is going to conduct the inspection. But a buyer can always, buyer personally, not buyer's uncle or buyer's best friend who happens to have expertise, only the buyer personally, other than a licensed home inspection, can conduct a whole home inspection of the seller's property. Okay, so that's where this question finds us. Buyer broker is writing the offer, including a Form 35, knowing that buyer personally is going to inspect seller's home. Buyer is not hiring a licensed home inspector and not bringing in any other third party to conduct the whole home or the general home inspection of seller's home. With that knowledge, buyer broker has the question of, what if buyer needs additional inspection time? We know that we're going to have this problem under Form 35 where Form 35 says if buyer wants to trigger the additional inspection time, and actually let's take one step backwards one more time. Remember that in Form 35, the way that Form 35 is set up, boilerplate language, buyers have an initial inspection period, and then if they trigger it, they have an additional inspection time. And buyer and seller can agree to any number of days on either of those time periods, but by default, the initial inspection time period is 10 days. The additional inspection time period is 5 days, okay? 10-day period, 5-day period. And based on the boilerplate language of Form 35, buyer can only trigger the additional inspection time if buyer attaches the recommendation only of the buyer's home inspector to the properly marked Form 35R, section number 1, where buyer claims the additional inspection time. So that's really what this question is all about. Knowing that buyer has to include the home inspector's recommendation for additional inspections, can buyer do that if buyer conducts their own inspection? Here's what I want you to think about, buyer brokers, as you draft Form 35 prior to seller's acceptance. Knowing that buyer is going to do their own inspection, knowing that buyer may not be able to trigger the additional inspection time based on how Form 35 is interpreted, avoid the interpretation issue altogether by negotiating up front for a sufficient amount of time in the initial inspection period to give your buyer all the time they need to do all of the inspections they need to do, including their own and then any follow-up specialist inspections that would be allowed by Form 35. That may be more than 10 days. If buyer is thinking, I want my 10 days in the initial time period, plus I want this additional 5-day inspection time period, then buyer brokers, maybe you negotiate for 15 days up front. Recognize, of course, that a 10-day period plus a 5-day period is really different than 15 days. 15 days would be a single time period, all calendar days. The initial inspection period and the additional inspection period based on the boilerplate language or the default language, 10 days would be calendar days. The additional inspection time period would be a standalone time period of 5 days, which would be business days only. You'd have two separate time periods, neither of which could end on a weekend or holiday. So a buyer is really not getting an apples for apples amount of time by claiming 15 days versus an initial inspection time period of 10 days and an additional inspection time period of 5 days. It's not exactly the same, but buyer broker, that's a conversation you're going to have with your buyer. There is a difference between a buyer hiring a licensed home inspector and doing their own inspection themselves. And this buyer is one of those differences. I think that your buyer will be better served, though, by negotiating this issue up front rather than having a battle with the seller after the fact about whether or not buyer can trigger the additional inspection period. If you have questions on this topic or any other, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.